I'm Riley Olson,
I'm Evan Kaiser.
I'm Alyssa Hyduke.
I'm Emma Berthold.
and we're going to be going over Johnson & Johnson. Okay. To start today's agenda, we're going to begin with a select history of the company, and then we're going to go and look at some current problems that have been noted in that history. Then we would go over an analysis of the external environment, followed by an analysis of the internal environment. And to finish up the presentation, we'll discuss some strategic alternatives that the company should take and what we recommend the company doing. For the company, For the company history, we'll go over some important dates and the effects those had on the company. Johnson & Johnson was founded in 1866 by three Johnson brothers. They wanted to create sterile dressings for wounds, which quickly grew into several different product lines. They created the first medical kit or first aid box for people working on the railroads, and they would create a baby powder formula that helps alleviate children's rashes, and one that we still see today. As their product lines would grow and develop, they would acquire different medical companies. In 1959, they acquired the McNeil Laboratories for the US and Sealag Chemi for the European market. These two pharmaceutical companies were Johnson & Johnson's ticket into the pharmaceutical industry. As time progresses, they would acquire over 250 different companies, so it wouldn't be a good use of our time right now to review each of those. Thus, I'm going to change our historical lens to look at the public image of how the company has been in the recent years. In 1982, a string of 7 murders occurred in the Chicago area. People were being killed by Tylenol laced with cyanide. Johnson & Johnson did a full recall of Tylenol across the United States, and this created a push for tamper-proof pill containers, as well as this is going to be our example for a positive recall. Throughout the 2000s, they were cited by the FDA for releasing products that were not fully approved yet, and they had conducted several acts of corporate misconduct. In 2010, a group of shareholders would accuse 7 subsidiaries of crimes and bad business practices. In 2010 would also be marked by a massive hip replacement recall. The acquisition of J&J was peddling drugs to the elderly that had not been fully FDA approved yet, and the recall of 43 different drugs for children and 49 different drugs for adults. During the 2000s and 2010s, J&J would go from one of the most beloved companies to being seen as just another big pharma company trying to squeeze a dollar. J&J has had several problems that are affecting the company. These problems are affecting their public image and the credibility as a family-friendly option. Due to lawsuits and recalls throughout recent years, they went from being ranked 9th to being ranked 57th out of 58 big pharma companies in regards to public image. And this was from a UK source, but the issues fall on the company's corporate governance and how they are not making the decisions that show Johnson & Johnson is a family-friendly company. Recalls are not a bad thing in the sense that you are pulling bad products off the street, like what they did in 1982, but faulty products that failed inspections and have not been fully FDA approved are a different thing. The company's quality control is statistically out of control. For example, the hip replacements in 2010 had failed 12%. A failing hip replacement is deemed a failure when they need to be replaced, and 12% of the hip replacements needed a second surgery and a new piece of equipment put in. That number should be around 1%. The company is also facing an estimated $15 billion in punitive damages as of October of last year, according to TheGuardian.com. These lawsuits cover everything from joint replacement recalls to company fraud and bribery. There are a few subsidiaries that are ruining the brand image of the entire company, affecting over 250 different businesses. J&J's lack of corporate governance will continue to decrease their brand image until something is done to correct this issue. And so next, we'll go over the analysis of the external environment.
All right, as Riley mentioned, we're going to go over the analysis of the external environment. First, we're going to start with Pastel analysis. And in the Pastel analysis, we'll talk about the political, economic, social, cultural, technological, environmental, and legal. First, political. Under this, we have taxes, government regulations, and product labeling. So taxes, every company has to pay taxes on the products. But J&J being a global company, taxes vary from country to country. For example, when new tax laws in the U.S. that was put into play in 2018 aimed to bring back overseas revenue, J&J lost close to $13.6 billion due to this new tax law, and also recorded a quarterly loss. Since then, they have been able to plan their business strategies to avoid these losses, but taxes are a huge part of the political scheme. Next, we'll talk about government regulation. Governments all over the world have rules and regulations that are put in place in order to protect their citizens from the effects of pharmaceutical drugs. The U.S. Regulation Center is known as the FDA, and the FDA has a 12 to 15 year process that it takes for a new pharmaceutical drug to get approved. This process also takes a median of $19 million. So this is a long process and an expensive process that Johnson & Johnson has to follow. Continuing on with government regulations, once these products are approved by the FDA, they have to have product labelings. For some, this is a big deal, and for others, it's not. It's basically up to the consumer. So for people that read product labels and see that these side effects and risks are part on these drugs, they tend to shy away from these drugs and not purchase them. While other people are just like, I need some ibuprofen or I need some Tylenol. I'm not going to read the side effects. I'd rather just take the pharmaceutical drug and deal with it. Next, we'll talk about GDP or economic. So in the economic, GDP and economic growth, these two are pretty simple. When GDP and economic growth are high, people are more willing to spend their money. When GDP and economic growth are low, people are less willing to spend their money. And this definitely deals with the pharmaceutical drugs because drugs are somewhat expensive. So when GDP and economic growth are high, it allows people to spend their money more. Next, we'll talk about the pandemic. During times of pandemic, people are typically less willing to spend their money. This does affect Johnson & Johnson's overall revenue for these periods of time, but also kind of gives them a little bit of an opportunity to focus on developing new pharmaceutical drugs or antibiotics that they can help in that time of pandemic. For example, now they are focusing on creating an antibiotic or a cure for COVID. They have delegated $1 billion into producing this cure. Sociocultural, the two main sociocultural things tie in together in the fact that Johnson & Johnson doesn't have a proper demographic to target. So with overall age, millennials and Gen Z demographic make up over 60% of the market, but it is seen unethical by many of the consumers to target these demographics due to their age and due to the relatedness of how severe the opioid crisis is in the U.S. Next, we'll talk about socioeconomic status. So with socioeconomic status, it matters because when the middle to upper classes are willing to pay that money for those out-of-pocket pharmaceutical drugs, and they also are more likely to have health insurance, which helps cover costs of these pharmaceutical drugs, while the lower class is less likely to have the money to pay for these drugs and much more less likely to have the health insurance to cover these pharmaceutical drugs. So in order for them to get these drugs prescribed from a doctor, they must pay out of pocket, and those doctor visits can be very, very expensive. Under technological, the three main things are the JLabs, apps, and digital ecosystems. So JLabs is Johnson & Johnson's new innovation centers that they are producing to provide guidance for upcoming and startup companies that are working on developing new pharmaceutical drugs. JLabs is the facility that they provide to these new upcoming companies to help boost them into the market, but it also allows Johnson & Johnson to help get their name out there and help produce these products and market their products even more. Apps and digital ecosystems kind of tie into each other. They have a multitude of apps that help the consumer decide whether it's time for allergy seasons to take their allergy pills, or to track their blood glucose levels, to make sure they're taking the insulin, also to see if their rheumatoid arthritis drugs are working or whatnot. So their apps and digital ecosystem are very easy to use, and it's basically produced for the consumer to use in order to track their daily lives. Under environmental, there are four main things: earth wards, low emission zones, and reusable packaging. So earth wards are awards that Johnson & Johnson have gotten for being one of the green companies. They have over 139 awards. Next is the low emission zones. Johnson & Johnson has vouched to become a provider of low emission zones all over the globe, not just in the US. And then going on to reusable packaging, Johnson & Johnson has vouched by 2025 that 100% of their plastic packaging packaging will be recyclable or compostable. Lastly, our green tariffs. Johnson & Johnson has just recently signed a green tariff, is what you can call it, and the fact that one of their plants in Georgia, their production plants, have agreed to go half of their energy being produced from solar panels, and this allows to cut back on those low emission zones and be a part of that. In the future, you will see probably a lot of these Johnson & Johnson companies going towards low emission or going towards solar panel use. Lastly is the legal. As Riley stated, there's a lot of lawsuits going on with Johnson & Johnson, and one of the largest lawsuits that they have with the pharmaceutical side of things is in Oklahoma, where they lost $562 million due to their responsibility in Oklahoma's opioid crisis. Next is employment laws. Johnson & Johnson is a global company, so they have to follow many of each demographic's employment laws. Waste laws also is the same thing. Johnson & Johnson has to follow the local waste laws, and they do it by a hierarchy of the waste in order to provide a safe way for their company to reduce the waste. Next, Alyssa will talk about the Porter's Five Forces.
All right. Thank you, Evan. So first we are going to discuss, I first want to emphasize that we're going to do the Porter's Five Forces over the pharmaceutical industry. So first we are going to go in the threat of new entrants, and that we deem to be very low due for multiple factors. The first one being the economies of scale. With how big these companies are, they do mass produce, so then in turn they do get lower costs. And then another major one are capital requirements. Cost of research alone is accounted to be $80 billion a year. And then the pharmaceutical industry has advocated that it costs about $2.6 billion by the time they can bring one new drug to the market. And trials with fewer than 100 patients have an average cost of $6 million. And on top of just the research and the constructing of the drug, you do need the facilities to do so. And just one manufacturing facility typically costs between $200 and $500 million. And government regulations play a role in this. As Evan mentioned, the U.S. does have the FDA, which they are responsible for ensuring that pharmaceutical companies thoroughly test new products for efficacy and safety. And then we also have distribution channels. Because so many of these large companies have been established for so long, they do have a pretty renowned presence in the distribution side of the pharmaceutical industry, such as being in popular chain stores of Target and Walmart or Walgreens. And an important fact to note is just in 2018 alone, the chain store spent $140 billion on pharmaceuticals. So a company's ability to be a strong presence in these stores does bring in a lot of revenue. And then again, we do have brand recognition being a key factor. This again correlates with the importance of being established in distribution channels. The more that you're in distribution channels and the more that your brand is recognized, the more money you'll bring in. And if you're not an established firm, it is going to be hard to have this overall brand recognition, as consumers are more likely to trust and buy products that from a brand that they recognize. And then finally, the main incumbency cost advantage falls under product operations, and those are the patents. Under product operations, patents are protect drugs from being imitated for about 20 years. So when a drug becomes under patent, it faces no price caps or competitors for about 20 years, giving the patent holders market exclusivity. And then, so overall, we did deem that the threat to be low. Next, we'll move into the competitive rivalry, and we deem that to be very high, as the number of existing firms we found to be 572 publicly traded firms amongst small and larger firms. Next, we do have high exit barriers. As I just did mention, the cost that's involved in setting up a pharmaceutical company and the research, and then just the emotional drive to be a leader. And then also the intellectual property plays a huge role in the competition, as there's a strong competition for high-level workers and researchers who can then thus create these products to then be patented, which then lead to profits overall in the end. So companies are always fighting to get the best researchers. And then growth opportunities, the pharmaceutical industry is expected to have an annual growth rate of 3 to 6%. And the top pharmaceutical company in 2019, Pfizer, they had revenues of $51.75 billion. And a study was found that by 2023, it estimates that pharmaceutical sales will top $420 billion, accounting for nearly 1.7% of the national GDP and 9.7% overall of health expenditures. So again, with these growth opportunities, these top companies are going to be fighting tooth and nail to then grab more of that market share. And then we'll move on to the bargaining power of suppliers. We deem this to be relatively low because there are a large amount of these raw material suppliers. And in the pharmaceutical industry, the materials that are needed to manufacture these drugs are considered commodity-like. So you can, that means the suppliers can't really raise prices because then the company can just choose the supplier who's then producing it cheaper. And then also to correlate that, most equipment is readily available. And then there also are low switching costs due to the cost and knowledge, low switching costs, as I mentioned, the prices not being a significant role. And then also there's a low threat for forward integration from the suppliers, as the cost and knowledge that comes with the pharmaceutical industry will make it very difficult for suppliers to become their own company and then in turn be successful. And the firms are relatively significant to the supplier. Yes, there are countless pharmaceutical companies, but because of the commodity that is being produced, these companies are relatively significant to the supplier's revenue, as many of these chemicals or many of these products in the new drugs cannot be used in day-to-day products. So then we'll move on to the bargaining power of buyers. This we did deem to be moderate due to the fact that so much of companies' revenue comes from buyers who buy in bulk, such as hospitals and healthcare organizations. So they do depend on these large purchases. So they do have to be smart with their prices when they are then selling to these large companies. But then if you look at an individual consumer, they really don't have any buying power, as they are buying from pharmacies or chain stores. So the price is what they see. And then also there is a differentiation in products though when the drug is still under patent. As I mentioned, patents last about 20 years. So when these drugs are under patents, there are no generic products to imitate. So that is the product then you are going to have to buy. But as then once the generic drug does come out, there are many buyer alternatives, and these tend to be a lot cheaper. And then buyers do pose a low threat, as again I mentioned, the amount of research, capital, and intellectual property that is needed to be a big player in the pharmaceutical industry. So then we'll move on to the threat of substitutes. We did deem this to be moderate due to how close generic brands, once they do become available, fulfill the consumer's needs, because generic brands are required to have the same active ingredients, dosage, intended use, side effects, all those different things that come along with the drugs. And then also there are alternative medications and treatments that have become more popular, such as yoga, meditation, or other therapies such as the homeopathic or herbal treatments. And also the promotion of a healthier lifestyle, including a balanced diet and exercise, has become more popular in many treatments or conditions, as consumers are becoming more health conscious and becoming more aware of what they are putting into their body. So just to give you guys a quick overview, again, we did do the 4 to 5 forces on the pharmaceutical industry, and we deemed the threat of new entrants to be low, along with the bargaining power of suppliers. Bargaining powers of buyers and the threat of substitute is moderate, but competitive rivalry was deemed to be high. But overall, the pharmaceutical industry is a relatively attractive industry to get to be a part of, as there is low threat from new entrants, and the growth opportunities are expected just to continually rise. So next, we will go into an analysis of the internal environment, and I will be starting off with that. We're going to first look at the strengths and weaknesses of Johnson & Johnson as a whole. One of their main strengths contributing to their success and revenue growth is their ability to innovate, and one of these innovations they have are their innovation centers, also known as their J-Labs. Evan had touched on that, but their innovation centers are located in San Diego and San Francisco, California, Ontario, Canada, Cambridge and Lowell, Massachusetts, Houston, Texas, New York, Shanghai, Belgium, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So as you see that they do have these J labs throughout the country, but also globally, and their technology in these innovations has also given them many opportunities to grow. To capitalize on these J labs, the program does provide capital and resources to where emerging companies can transform their scientific discoveries into future healthcare products. And just for instance, over the past 6 years, the J Labs have allowed more than 430 startups to set up shop and try and grow. And then also 26% of the residence companies are currently conducting human trials, and 25% do have commercial products on the market. Also, to tap into the technology, since February, Johnson & Johnson has been conducting preclinical testing of more than 10 potential COVID-19 vaccines. And on March 30th, they actually announced the selection of their lead candidate with 2 backups, and they expect to begin clinical studies of this candidate in September. And to also capitalize on the technology, Johnson & Johnson also just recently came out with the first of its kind contact lens, and it allows consumers to quickly adjust from clear to dark in changing light conditions. And next, we'll look at their partnerships and acquisitions. They are involved in countless collaborations or acquisitions and mergers through, globally and locally. A new global collaboration was the first of its kind recently. It was a combination of philanthropy organizations, non-for-profit, and private sector organizations who are all coming together to work to find a treatment for tuberculosis. Also, Johnson & Johnson recently acquired Verb Surgical to combine Johnson's resources and global reach with Verb's world-class robotics and scientific capabilities. So these partnerships and acquisitions really allow them to collectivize innovation and their technology, along with the resources and expertise of other companies, then to combine and create critical health products to enhance consumer health. Another strength of theirs is their global expansion. They have 250 subsidiaries ranging from consumer health products, medical devices, and pharmaceutical products. And this does tie in with their variety of products, their global reach. And to be more specific about the global reach, they have operations in 60 countries and have products sold in over 175. In addition to that, they do have 350 distribution centers globally. Their last strength I'd really like to harp on is their corporate culture. Johnson & Johnson has made a strategic shift in how they approach clinical trials, focusing on educating the diverse communities about the importance of participating. So with that, in their ongoing trial for lupus, 38% of their participants are from underrepresented groups, where the industry average is only 12%. Their J Labs leadership is largely female, and more than 26% of the residence companies are led by females. And the study also found that 23% of the companies are minority led. And to cap on that, Johnson & Johnson 2018 was recognized by as a top company for diversity councils by Supplier and Diversity and LGBT employees. To talk about their weaknesses, yes, I did capitalize on how diversified and how inclusive their corporate culture is, but their corporate responsibility is a different thing. Recently, they have been on trial and have had to settle lawsuits regarding their unethical production, as a jury in Philadelphia awarded a man $8 billion in damages after he claimed that the company did not warn him that one of their antipsychotic drugs could cause them to grow breasts. Also, Johnson & Johnson agreed to pay 2 Ohio counties a total of $20 million to avoid a first series of federal trials regarding the opioid crisis. And they've also been on trial for being accused of knowing about the negative side effects of their products and not warning people. So that has tarnished their brand reputation image. They've also recently increased their prices, and they raised the U.S. drug prices on around 24 prescription drugs. And also, as I mentioned, from this unethical production and lack of corporate responsibility, as Riley mentioned earlier, they their brand reputation was once in ninth place, but now it's 57th out of the 58 pharmaceutical companies. So now I will pass it over to Evan to talk about the opportunities and threats.
Thank you, Alyssa. Going on to opportunities, as I mentioned earlier, GDP and economic growth, when those two are high, it provides an opportunity for Johnson & Johnson to increase their revenue due to consumers' willingness to buy and willingness to spend. Another opportunity, as Alyssa and I have harped on, are these J-Labs. J-Labs are a huge opportunity for Johnson & Johnson to continue their innovation and partner with these upcoming pharmaceutical companies to get their name out there and provide basically a umbrella for these companies for their pharmaceutical drugs. A third opportunity is their apps and digital ecosystem. These apps and digital ecosystem allow the consumers to interact with Johnson & Johnson products and track their overall health very easily and very simply. And in this time where health is one of the major trends or fads in society, these apps allow the Johnson & Johnson company to provide a nice necessity for the consumer. Another opportunity is the green tariff. As I mentioned, Johnson & Johnson is more than likely headed towards a lot of solar energy for their use of energy in their plants and production. Solar energy will allow them to also incorporate their low emission zones that they're trying to work on. So you may expect to see a lot of Johnson & Johnson companies headed towards solar panel use. A couple threats are the taxes I mentioned. The U.S. tax that was implemented made Johnson & Johnson have a loss for that quarter, which is very unusual for a company as large as Johnson & Johnson. But taxes do change over time, and Johnson & Johnson has to adapt to these taxes. Another threat is product labeling. As I mentioned earlier, with product labeling, certain people read them, certain people do not, but the people that do read them may be turned away from Johnson & Johnson products due to the risks that are labeled on their products. For example, Xarelto is one of their blood thinners, and in this risk, it says increased chance of bleeding that can lead to death. So as some people, that is a deal. For others, it's not. Another one is overall age. As I mentioned, it's unethical by consumers and many people to target these young demographics due to the opioid crisis in today's society. So Johnson & Johnson has to figure a new way how to advertise their products to make it seem safe for these users. And last is the biggest one that has been basically done their brand reputation, as Alyssa and Riley have talked about, are the lawsuits. Lawsuits are huge for Johnson & Johnson right now. If they can figure out somehow to fix their products and prevent these lawsuits from happening, then they might be able to flip their company around. But the threat of these lawsuits on Johnson & Johnson is huge. Next, we'll talk about the value chain. So primary activities in the value chain are inbound logistics, operations, outbound logistics, marketing, sales, and services. So with the inbound logistics, the suppliers of the products of these pharmaceutical drugs, of these packagings, of all the parts and pieces that go into making a Johnson & Johnson product, help fulfill their mission. And they also use supplier diversity. As Alyssa said, that's part of the reason why supplier bargaining is very low. Operations, they are a global company that runs on a product locally. So they're all over the world and they provide local products. Outbound logistics, they use a variety of sources in order to get their products out there: air freight, port systems, highways, railways. Marketing, sales, they are globally recognized. As we mentioned, it was good at one point and now it's bad. The services, since they are a publicly owned company, they have to provide quarterly results so that their shareholders or stockholders or investors can determine whether they want to continue investing in the Johnson & Johnson. They also do provide customer service, and that's mostly just to deal with their mishaps on their products. The secondary activities, the technology, as we mentioned, J-Labs innovation centers are huge for Johnson & Johnson's success. HR management, they are a well-paying job that provides strong benefits. And they also believe in investing in their employees to create a virtuous cycle. And this cycle is to create generational wealth in order to create more wealth in the Johnson & Johnson community. Procurement, suppliers to perform ethically and uphold the Credo values. The Credo values is Johnson & Johnson's mission statement, and it's a large mission statement to say the least. But they really focus on their employees being an individual rather than just a number at a desk. In the firm infrastructure, there's 130,000 employees worldwide, and there's a board of directors that help overlook multiple decisions. Now, Alyssa will talk about Brino.
Thank you, Evan. So first, we're going to harp on the innovation. I know Evan and I have spent a while doing that already. So innovation does allow Johnson & Johnson to have a sustained competitive advantage, as it does bring value to them. It is rare as how many JLab, for example, all their JLab locations and the first of their kind innovations they're coming out. It is also inimitable. Yes, companies do have a lot of these research centers, but the amount of innovation that does consistently come out of Johnson & Johnson is hard to imitate, along with just the first class and world-renowned innovation centers they have. And as I mentioned, then these are organized for profit, as a lot of patent products do come out of these. Their global distribution network, their global presence is valuable, as they do reach a wide range of demographics and cultures. It is, I would argue that it is rare to have just like this extensive reach, as it comes from their 250 subsidiaries. It is, however, imitable as there are multiple global companies, but it is organized for profit, as they do have an analytics tool that they recently came out with to help their supply and demand, and it's to help improve their downtime and manufacturing lines, and then this then makes them produce more efficiently, saving them money in the end. Their brand recognition is another large resource and capability. Yes, their reputation has taken a hit, but they still are a globally recognized brand, which brings value to them again. And it is rare to have this kind of global reach. Just in 2019, the company announced that it earned a #1 ranking on the Working Mothers 100 Best Company list for the 34th consecutive year in a row. So that kind of consistent recognition is hard to attain, and it is organized for profit again, as they're recognized they do bring in more revenue. Their diversification, what I mean by that is their ability to acquire, merge, and partner. This brings so much value to them, as it brings in new technology, new resources, new scientists, and it is rare how many and how often they do come up with all these diversifications. And I would argue that it is inimitable, because how many, as I mentioned earlier, that was just a few lists. Another one is that they just recently acquired Excellion for $30 billion to spin out a new R&D company. So their ability to pour in this capital and consistently come out with successful results from these partnerships and mergers and acquisitions is inimitable, and again, organized for profit. Their company culture, again, I would argue that it is Brino as well, as their corporate culture does bring value to the company, as people do want to work in a company that respects diversity. It is rare for a company nowadays to get consistent recognition from multiple different sources, as just, for example, the Disability Inn awarded Johnson & Johnson Best Places to Work for Disabilities Inclusion in 2018. And in 2019, Johnson & Johnson made the Diversity Incorporation Hall of Fame. And also in 2018, Thomas Reuters Diversity and Inclusion Index ranked Johnson & Johnson #2 among top 100 most diverse and inclusive organizations globally. So their ability to then consistently produce results and be recognized for this is rare and inimitable. And again, it is organized for profit, as this does entice workers to come work for an environment that is so inclusive. And now we will move to the strategic alternatives with Emma.
Thanks. So the strategic alternatives are established to hopefully redirect Johnson & Johnson's original problems with their brand image and reputation. The increase of credibility will help them minimize future lawsuits with competitors or third-party firms, which in turn will resolve a few of the problems mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. The first alternative we would like to focus on is improving their image of the people in the brand. And as Evan mentioned in the pestle analysis, Johnson & Johnson is focusing their efforts during this pandemic on reallocating the money away from production, since most consumers aren't willing to purchase extra commodities right away in this state of emergency, and do more research on the coronavirus. This would show consumers that they are striving to redefine their brand as a whole. Also, this would help increase the brand's reputation by giving back to the pharmaceutical industry. Luckily, one of Johnson & Johnson's strengths is how They have won many awards for their diversity, as Alyssa has mentioned, which can help support their brand image further. Speaking of diversity, another alternative would be addressing the unethical problems Johnson & Johnson has faced over the years by diversifying their existing workforce. This will allow their production to be done in a more efficient manner and without consumer recourse. Because they have dealt with the wide range of recalls and product complaints, Johnson & Johnson should provide extra training to their employees who would hold positions that deal with product manufacturing and consumer services. So this will help them better understand why consumers are unhappy with their products and how to respond effectively to those conflicts, which would overall increase the company's ranking. So our recommendation in the end would be to go with improving their brand image of the people and the company as a whole. By doing this, they will see a difference in the overall company culture and reputation. And being upfront with the community, they can grow their customer loyalty, allow for the business to be transparent, and reestablish themselves as a pharmaceutical leader. So their products and services then will speak for themselves. So please post any questions you have to Blackboard, and thanks for listening.